Hey, me again. Here's part 2 of 3 on connecting with God. Same deal as last week, we're looking at John's Gospel from the Bible. We're still in chapter 1. It'll help you to have the passage open in front of you. Check the link in the description. A few years back, I was at a dinner party with some friends. I think I'd come late. I was sat at the end of the table. And because I'd just started working for a church, the other two people at the end were asking me questions about God. And they had some thoughts, and we chatted for a bit. But after a while, the conversation moved on to how we could really know. I told them what I said in last week's video. We can know God because he's introduced himself in Jesus Christ. Jesus, the Word who was in the beginning with God, our point of contact with our Maker. Jesus, the light of men, shining God's truth into our darkness. Jesus has made God known. And at this point, the guy 2 chairs down turned our quiet conversation in the corner into a whole table brouhaha. You know what problem I've always had with this? If it was obvious, more people would believe. My aim in this video is to show you that God has made the truth about himself plain and freely accessible to all. And he's done it through the defining moment in history our verses are centered around. John 1 verse 9, the true light which enlightens everyone was coming into the world. John 1 verse 14, and the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. Jesus introduces God by coming into our world as flesh and bone to live alongside humanity. Do you see, as long as God is outside of the world and no one's ever seen God, we have no way of connecting with our Creator. But if God comes down from heaven and walks the earth, then we've got something to latch onto. The world got to see and touch and hear God as his sandals hit the roads of Israel 2,000 years ago. Just 2 points for you today from the surrounding verses. Both center around Jesus coming into the world to make God known. First point, Jesus is public news. In verse 6, we get introduced to Jesus' publicist. There was a man sent from God whose name was John. He came as a witness to bear witness about the light, that all might believe through him. He was not the light, but came to bear witness about the light. This is John the Baptist, different John to the one who wrote the Gospel. John the Baptist is the guy with the megaphone. Bearing witness is about getting the truth out in the open. Before the light comes into the world, John announces that the light is coming into the world. He predicts the event ahead of time. And when you predict an event ahead of time, it's just automatically much less secretive and hidden. If you were around in John's day, there was just no chance that you'd miss the event of God coming into the world. You were expecting it. You knew what you were looking for. And there are always crazy people in the world making all sorts of predictions about the future, but not usually with John's platform. He was recognized as a prophet and was fast becoming the most popular man in Israel. Think of someone like The Rock tweeting to the world about what's to come. Here he is advertising an energy drink that looks comically small in his hand, but he's getting the word out there, and people hear about it more than they would if it was just the guy on the left giving the announcement. John the Baptist's witness about Jesus is like a widespread celebrity announcement. The news of God's arrival broadcasted to the world. Jesus didn't just come into the world in some secret corner to only be seen by a few. He was hotly anticipated. The world was waiting. And if you read on in this chapter, you'll see that when Jesus does arrive, John's there to point to him and say, look, there's the guy. He's over there with the neon sign. If you want to meet God, he's right that way. Jesus stepped into the world on the global stage as headline news, with all the attention and fuss you'd expect if God himself came to visit. When God makes himself known to the world, it's not just that he's out there somewhere, a needle in a haystack that only a few careful seekers will find. Locating God is more like finding oxygen on planet Earth. The truth about God is commonly available, out there for anyone to know. Jesus makes God known, and Jesus is public news on planet Earth. And just think of how aware the world is of Jesus. All over the world, people have heard of Jesus. Go to Kenya and people will celebrate him in public. In China, the authorities are trying to suppress the underground church. In our own country, the teaching of Jesus makes up the foundation of our very laws and morality. Even this week, Joe Biden was sworn in as the President of the United States with a Bible in his hand. By making his arrival public, God has made himself obvious in the world. The truth about him is within our reach. But point 2, people don't always believe the truth. God came into the world to make himself obvious, but verses 9 to 11 aren't how you'd expect the world to respond. Verse 9, the true light, which enlightens everyone, was coming into the world. He was in the world, and the world was made through him, yet the world did not know him. He came to his own, and his own people did not receive him. It's the problem my friend raised at the dinner party. God comes into the world, but the world isn't convinced. After all John the Baptist's hype, people met Jesus and thought, maybe not. And so my friend would say that the world's lack of belief in God would suggest God didn't make himself clear. If he had, surely more people would believe in him. And what John writes is true. Jesus was widely rejected in his time. So much so that a massive crowd decided to execute him in public with no one to jump to his defense. And still today, millions and millions of people in the world don't believe that Jesus is who he says he is. And so you might assume it's just because Jesus hasn't made himself obvious enough. But there's another explanation. Actually, it's the explanation in the verses we just read. John's claim is that God really did come into the world to make himself known to the world, but when the world stared their maker in the eye, they didn't know who they were looking at. It's not about God doing a bad job of introducing himself. It's about people being bad at recognizing the truth. Had you ever considered that possibility? That the world has it in them to fail to recognize that the God who is in the beginning is sat opposite them at the dinner table. But it shouldn't be surprising that people aren't always good at knowing what's true. We're often pretty lazy when it comes to doing our own investigation. We can read a headline and convince ourselves we've taken in the article. Or we usually believe things that suit us and what we want. Or we tend to just go with the flow. What do other people think? That sounds sensible. This is a fun book to read if you want to see how bad we can be at determining truth. It's called Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman. Here's a quick puzzle it gives as an example. Don't try to solve it, just listen to your intuition. A bat and ball cost $1.10. The bat costs $1 more than the ball. How much does the ball cost? Got it? The number that comes to us is 10 cents. The answer is 5 cents. Do the math later, that's right. But intuition and popular opinion can be wrong. And even if you're not sure, just notice what John isn't arguing for. He's not saying Jesus came into the world and everyone believed in him, so you should too. John is saying God has revealed himself, though the world didn't believe in him. And so rather than deciding that it can't be obvious because the world doesn't believe, instead ask yourself, why might the world not believe? Is it for good reasons, or is it for lazy ones? Is it for bad reasons? Could it even be for selfish reasons? And especially when verse 14 shows the other side of the coin of how people responded when they met Jesus. Verse 14, and the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we have seen his glory, glory as of the only Son from the Father, full of grace and truth. God makes himself obvious by announcing Jesus to the world and then sending Jesus into the world. There were many who didn't receive him, but there were others who thought they'd met a man who had the kind of glory that could only belong to the Son of God. And so you've got to investigate for yourself. The truth is out there. Jesus is public news even 2,000 years on. At some point, going with the flow is just ignorance. The sort of ignorance claimed last week as police broke up an illegal party in Basingstoke. The occupants claimed they were unaware of the global pandemic as they never watched the news. God has made the news about Jesus widely available. Anyone can look into him, and you'll find answers if you do. Thanks for watching. Again, I've put a couple questions in the description if you want to keep thinking about this. Otherwise, we'll be back again next week thinking about what it means to know God. See you then.